Okay, I'm going to be continuing now. So I just want to clean up something that I said in, I think it was the last recording that I made, where when I was talking about, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to be going all over the place, but hopefully this kind of radical moving around will eventually form, and something they'll start to see the totality of these structures and how they kind of blend together in some sense, or how they sort of overlap or impinge on one another, where they're located within one another. So when I said that, these four-star emotional tones, how that they will perhaps accumulate a lot of sort of cognitive dissonance because they have sort of less checks on them, because they're not, they have a kind of a niche where they are mechanically interrelated to other things, and therefore they can kind of be perhaps mechanically, a lot of the strain in the system will just kind of, it'll get shunted onto these things. Or perhaps that some people can use them in a robotic way, where they've learned a certain reductive sort of formulae of how to treat them, and they can kind of use this as a parlor trick, as a magic hat, that they can sort of repress things within, because they've got a mechanical way to deal with that part of the world. And so they've got a kind of mechanical interface, so they can kind of bleed tension into these four-star emotional tones. So where they exist within a particular field circuit, they can kind of be used to express tension from that field circuit onto another field circuit. So for example, this field circuit of man, this is kind of the triangle here, if you're cautious or shocked, you can kind of have that, a mechanical symmetry can correspond with being bashful or anxious, which is in the lion field circuit. So the kind of being shocked or cautious can sort of be translated into, if you're being cautious, you can translate that into a bashful kind of virtual emotional tone, and then you can kind of use that to freely indulge in either being cautious or shocked, because you can kind of create a sympathetic, bashful, or anxious virtual construct that sort of supplements or provides a collateral support. So you can indulge into being cautious or indulge into being shocked, and you can just kind of mechanically fob that off or pass that off as having a very virtual. So anyway, the thing that I really wanted to clean out, so I'm just re-explaining it perhaps a bit poorly, but the thing that I wanted to emphasize here is that I said that this is almost like an atheistic tool that someone has, but I meant that within a very kind of particular context, and it's not strictly speaking atheistic necessarily, but what I was trying to convey when I said that is that because where that falls short is that a lot of religious people could use this kind of bullshit artistry just the same, but in some sense the thing that actually, I mean, in my view, it's all atheism, because it lives within the narrative of karma, and essentially expecting God to be a kind of karmic judge, when the thing is that if you are deluded by this karmic superficial, sort of dance of forms, if you are mesmerized by that, if you're transfixed by that, you've already kind of. So I mean, this is going to get into a theme that I'm going to explore. So I mean, in my sense, it's kind of atheistic, where people have substituted the true God for the God of the world, the God of karma, the God of these emotional tones, essentially, and believing that there are special symmetries that have to be, that every reaction or every action has a commensurate reaction here, where you can't transcend this, or you can't get a handle on this. You have to go with the flow, or you have to kind of that these are like real entities rather than these being beasts. Like these are, in my view, this is what is described in Revelations when it talks about the four beasts around the throne of God that are essentially praising the throne. Anyway, but and the 24 elders would be these 24 emotional tones. These are 12 things, but they each are made up of 2 emotional tones. Anyway, so I think that these are the 24 elders and the 4 beasts. But anyway, so like you can't sort of you're kind of replacing God with the beasts, which is weird because in some sense, if there is something that relates to God here, it would be these 5 these 5 pointed stars to some degree. That sort of has a greater resonance with, you could say that maybe that's where the throne of God is intermingled amongst these wheels and these, sort of wheels within wheels and such. But anyway, the thing that I wanted to talk about was where this is found. So I haven't shown you an actual model of metagram circuitry, but let me explain some basics of it. So just from a structural technical point of view, because I can say these certain things which are these are consistent patterns within metagram circuitry. So essentially the oath and the worship is in this blue, and I call the oath and the worship together the emergent response because they both inform and come together to form one set of emotional tones. It might not be just one emotional tone, it might be more than one. The exception here is what I call the primary counteroffer, which is the answer and the prayer. The primary counteroffer will be contained within this inferior function, which is obviously the inferior function of the subconscious and the base or the foundation of the unconscious. But the primary counteroffer is, I believe that there's only ever one primary counteroffer. This is kind of like the linchpin of how the meta-type false ego complex translates itself into metagram. So sort of when this is formed, this I think is kind of the kernel of, let's say, the beginning of a proper development of the false ego complex. I think that you start off when you're born with kind of a super ego and a proto-ego, which even the ego itself can not really properly coalesce itself until you have a subconscious. So I think, as you have an ego, you have a kind of virtual subconscious. And as soon as the subconscious starts actually forming in some sense, one of the pivotal points when you actually sort of start to grow up, maybe around the ages from 3 to 7, something like that. I know that's quite a broad range, but I think that this is formed at around ordinarily the age of 5. I think 5 is probably a pretty good average here. And 4 or 5, maybe 4, 5, 6. Some people might be later than others. And this is where the game of developing into adulthood really starts, is when this creates a single emotional tone is identified and forms here. And then there's still pliability, because there's maybe some variability in terms of how this is coming together, that maybe other emotional tones, or I should be, okay. The thing that I want to describe here is that within metagram circuitry, the emotional tone in the primary counteroffer is always going to be opposite the emotional tone in the emergent response. So if I just look at any of these field circuits, did I not have a diagram? I would have liked to show it on this diagram. It would have been easier, but I don't have the. I just made a small folder. I can quickly go find it. So, if the primary counteroffer of some metagram circuit is cautious, at least one of the emergent response emotional tones will be shocked. That there's always essentially, and so they will always be at odds with one another. They will be sort of stuck in and this is, I think, a necessary feature. Man, I really don't want to condition this with weird speculation, but I mean, I might be generalizing it a bit too much, because in some sense, it might be that the emergent response might have the same elemental formula as what is opposed to that. So like this will either be kind of alchemically opposed, or perhaps it'll be opposed within the field circuit. But it's perhaps one of the it's perhaps slightly ambiguous. And sorry, but so either this this emergent response will be opposite to this in terms of the field circuit, or it will have the same elemental signature but be a different one. But I think that it's probably going to always be the opposite in the field circuit, and this is required so that the unconscious side of the mind can almost, I think it is correctly almost to say that it's going to be hermetically sealed. And this is, I think, why Metagram develops. This is the structural necessity that Metagram is fulfilling for the false ego complex. This is why Metagram develops, is because we need the compliance or the collateral support of the beasts that surround the throne of God, essentially. We need to use those energies, those beastly karmic energies, to help us carry the water, or to do the work of maintaining the false ego complex. In some sense, to take the pressure off of the superego and ego, we need to sort of create a stable window of, you know, so I mean, Keegan stage 3 essentially is what also, I mean, I link that to the unconsciousness, because, you know, you have to have a conceptualization of what it is that you do. You know, this is the question that the Queen always asks everyone when she meets them. She says, what do you do? It's a beautifully profound and deep and broad question, because you have to answer. I mean, there's no one who can't not answer that question, because everyone will have to have some idea about what it is that they do, you know. And so where does that idea come from? And I'm saying on a kind of structural level that these are the sort of the psychological nuts and bolts of it, as it were. And I think that, you know, anyway, I mean, I can make more general sort of trite statements about this, but essentially that, I think, is doing a lot of the work of the false ego complex. This is, you know, a lot of this is the backbone, is the unconscious side of the mind. And once that emerges, then you've actually kind of created almost vaguely a self-sustaining delusion, as it were, in which this is going to be as true as the metaphysical brick and mortar that made it up. You know, so the field circuits and the correspondences of symmetries and inverse symmetries, you know, as true as these things are, your false ego complex is going to borrow that epistemological merit, as it were. So, you know, this really is a kind of a totality of the kinds of, you know, these are the constituents of thinking. These are the ingredients of how thought operates within the mind. And, you know, it always has the propensity to move, but it moves, I believe, these are all the channels that exist. These are all the grooves in which karmic energy transmutates between one another. And then essentially, because the false ego complex, you know, we're going to have a very static metatype, and then we're going to pigeonhole ourselves further than that with metagram circuitry. And when those two things combine, we've pigeonholed ourselves into a kind of corner where we've got these nodes that have to be satisfied, and therefore we have a kind of environmental projection, but I'm saying, okay, I mean that more abstractly than when I say environmental projection, because a lot of that environmental projection is going to be what is targeted in the development of the subconscious and the ego. And I actually, okay, let me just switch topics just to focus on talking about more deeply than I did before, the relationship between the subconscious and the ego. And I've even, if you look at my research notes and things like that, when I'm talking about this philosophically and trying to deeply delve into this stuff, at one point I completely mixed up the perspectival and the propositional. I said the ego is perspectival and the subconscious is propositional. And there is certainly some truth to that, because the one is meaningless without the other. Like the one is almost the premise of the other, and so they almost have to develop in tandem. They have to almost develop sort of so I think that there's a natural affinity here, and this is why sort of Keegan stage 2 has even been described as having a kind of pseudo Keegan stage 4, or a kind of pseudo Keegan stage 5. I can't remember exactly what they call it, but it's a kind of when you actually think that you've got a belief solution to the world, you've got like an answer to everything kind of thing, where your subconscious is kind of, in some sense, it's bypassing the problem of the unconsciousness, but you can be quite self-satisfied because you've got like a full set of perspectival answers to hard questions, and then you have a kind of propositional toolkit that you can always that you can use one of the instruments in your toolkit, and you're never sort of left wanting for anything, essentially. You can semantically or descriptively kind of invoke a narrative, or at least you can modify or adapt a narrative well enough, because these tools eventually can essentially reframe the narrative so radically that essentially the narrative is sort of inferior. Like there's no narrative that's going to have a framing that is going to override these tools, as it were. And I can almost agree with that. Like what I've just said is kind of mostly true, essentially. It's missing something. It's missing the idea that, what about responsibility for the construction that you've already produced, and that you've imbued with your tools, with your marvelous, almost magical tools of the subconscious and the ego. Now you've actually you've used your epistemic agency to bring to life something, to create something, and now you can't just kind of wish it away. Like you actually perhaps did something. And so the question of what do you do, I'm trying to, sorry, I mean, grammatically I would have liked to use it in the past tense, but then I'm kind of then the point that I'm trying to make also gets lost. But essentially, you have to have some kind of coherence in which you are tracking and monitoring your own activity, and so that essentially that you're not just a set of potential perspectives or potential propositions. You do actually retain some kind of memory, or some kind of capacity of plotting yourself within some domain. So I mean, this is what makes us particularly conscious, is that we are aware of our own awareness. We can sort of meta critique ourselves, or something like that. And so the perspectival and the propositional, in some sense, the participatory and the propositional is a much more rich but also confusing or complex dynamic. And then obviously it gets more complex when you relate the perspectival to the propositional, and then you relate the participatory to the propositional. Because of these two different natures, you've got a, you end up with a complicated intersection here, and that is philosophically profound, because there's going to be ways in which the one impacts the other, and it's not like a complete feedback. It's kind of like it. So I mean, anyway, it's okay. Well, maybe I should just talk about it in particular rather than trying to just illustrate some general things about it. But so it's going to be dynamic in a very kind of particular sort of way. And I mean, this is the problem that we have with language to a large extent. That we have our pre-verbal or pre-lingual or pre-language, we have almost a sense of our own intelligence, which, when it is sort of before we've languaged it in our minds, it's a perspectival intuition, maybe even, or it's a kind of it's a sense, but until you actually have to try to communicate it and put it into, let's say, the arena of what does it do in some, I don't want to say objective sense, but in some sense in which you can see it from outside your own purely relativistic kind of conjecture or hypothesis. Because anyway, so I mean, the subconscious usually has, I believe, a kind of, it's attenuated just by the general functioning of the false ego complex. It's going to have an awareness of the unconscious and the ego, and some sense it's going to have different matrices, different frameworks within itself. So I do think that the only way to know these things is through the subconscious. Without the subconscious, you're going to have no anchorage in which you can even sort of gauge the depth of the unconscious or even the ego. Because if there's no sequitur continuity within the subconscious framework, if there's no broadness, if there's no depth within the subconscious, if there's no patience, if there's no seriousness or carefulness. I mean, this is why some people who think obviously that they're quite intelligent and that they're quite profound or something like that, but they have no capacity to to patiently gather a somewhat novel perspective about something. They have no tolerance of new ideas. They have no tolerance of synthesizing, sort of slightly, potentially, or on the face of it, confusing or ostensibly very difficult, to kind of contend with ideas. They just kind of immediately reject this or something. So you have a kind of temperamental subconscious, juvenile kind of subconscious. And in some sense, this is usually always excused because the unconscious is so pressing, because you're so focused on getting something done within some arenic aspect. Like you're being pressed upon by some great, sort of quest or general sort of thing. And then the ego as well can also have perhaps its own kind of trapping in this, where, but obviously I think if you're kind of very invested in your ego and there isn't a kind of sort of integration between these things, you can be very hypothetical. You can be very imaginative in some sense. You can just kind of devolve into your own kind of propositional thought experimentation. But I'm not trying to put down these things, because these capacities independently are very important to master and to have, to know the extent of their the breadth and the depth of the capacity to use these things. But if you kind of don't use them with a mind of having any kind of integration, it's just going to be, or you have, kind of very particular, uh, I mean, this has the capacity to be very mesmerizing, the dominant function of the unconscious. And so you get people who sort of become unconscious sort of zealots or slaves, um, to some sort of theme here, and this, I think, can almost be exemplified as the Tower of Babel. Um, the unconscious dominant function can sort of transpire into quite a great, sort of project, which can overshadow, a proper integration of understanding what's going on here. You can just kind of just be mesmerized and warped into and that is a developmental challenge of teenagers, like 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, angsty teens, edge lords, edgy teens, which is perhaps a necessary developmental stage to some degree, um, because you want people who are dealing with their own internal, with the gravity of their own internal structure, as it were. Because if they are just kind of focused on maximizing, I know, their kind of their propositional ability to, I mean, in some sense, this is what the technology and the internet gives us, is that it's kind of allowed us to keep track of our propositional egos much better because of the memory, the virtual extension of our memory through technology. Is that, we can actually look back through our Facebook feed or look back through our history, our web browsing history, and then we can actually survey the monkey mind. You can actually see evidence of the monkey mind, and then you can actually summarize it. You can aggregate it into, I can see these patterns now, that actually, you can survey your own sort of, repetitive drama cycle, as it were, which would otherwise perhaps we would just be robotically living through and not ever sort of reflecting on it because we don't see evidence of it. But now, because of essentially the information overload, we collate things and we categorize them into patterns, and this allows us to sort of aggregate and to monitor our propositional propensity and sort of motivational scope of focus. So we can kind of survey our attention, how we are focusing our attention, in terms of our propositional preoccupations and such. And in some sense, this is also going to be somewhat a reflection of the perspectival, but differently, because the perspectival is kind of like, this I see as the operating system, and this is the software. You can have lots of different programs, and you can delete some programs and install some new programs on your operating software. But that's all made possible by the operating software, which these are sort of basic beliefs as well. And sometimes we have very complicated beliefs, which are even lead to cognitive dissonance, and then we have multiple frameworks, and we jump into one framework and we jump into another perspectival framework. Some people are completely different people depending on who they are around. You're just surrounded by different people, you become a different human being. You become, you completely become a different human, in terms of, I'm making a metaphor here, but essentially it just shows, sort of the potentially discontiguous nature of the different perspectival operating systems that we might have. And some people aren't interested in having a unified operating system. They're not interested in having an understanding. They don't want to have justified beliefs. I mean, this is one of the hacks that the people in sort of the Keegan stage sort of, is the idea that, this is a failed look, it is true that beliefs can never be true. Like, you can't expect to have true beliefs, but you can expect to have coherent and self-consistent beliefs that are justified. I think that there's such a thing as a justified belief. That doesn't mean to say that if you utter the right syllables and you mouth and you say something that you've cast a spell on something because you've said the secret code or something like that. Like that's not, meaning and purpose and context in some sense. You can't have beliefs without context, and in some sense this has to do with, like I could even say that I am very sympathetic with a lot of people's beliefs, but if it's not being articulated in the right, let's say, context of, and in some sense the thing that's really providing the context here is the unconscious side of the mind, is the thing that's mediating these things to some degree. As you can see that there's an overlap between the inferior function, the unconscious is containing both inferior functions, although I haven't spoken explicitly in this series about how the local inferior function, which is the foundation of the next side of the mind, how that interacts with, the dominant function, the parent function in the side of the mind. I guess I'll talk about this now. So, I mean, I have described it somewhat, like that it's like a capacitor that, sort of, but I would say that what I think is happening here is that what I'm about to say is an empirical observation. It's not true in theory. It's true based on my observation, essentially. And I think that how these things correspond to one another, how the parent function and the local inferior function correspond to one another, is up to the individual, essentially. Like they can choose how they kind of comport themselves. And in some sense, I've even encouraged that one of the ways that I think people can develop is that they essentially incorporate this inferior function into this dominant function. They kind of homogenize this. They let this be diminished. They let the dominant function be diminished by their local inferior function, and then they build back better the dominant function, and then that way you have a more integrated, these sides of the mind are going to end up being much more self-consistent over, we're not going to have these pockets of cognitive dissonance, essentially. And that also means that maybe the parent function can calm down a bit. So, what should I say? So I think that ordinarily, to begin with, that what the ordinary status quo is that the parent function does not like the local inferior function. It threatens its child function. The inferior function is very, it subverts, in some sense, I think Luke is describing these things, no, is it Luke? No, it's James. James describes the false ego complex, I believe, with these 6 component parts. He says, first there is lust, and then you are drawn away by the lust, and then when you're drawn away, you're also enticed, and then after you're enticed by the lust, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but and then he talks about that there's a trial, and when eventually after the trial, when the sin has been conceived, there is sin. Sorry, when I should actually find it. I'm butchering it quite badly. So, but anyway, he starts with the lust, and then he says that essentially when there's sin, then sin comes after the trial. When sin has been conceived, it arrives, it is accomplished, and then the sin comes with its death. Sorry, the sin. Man, let me actually just quickly find it. But every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Okay. Every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. So, if this is the lust, and I believe that the dominant function is when you are drawn away by the lust, and you are in fact creating knowledge of the world according to the lust. That is what it means to be drawn away by the lust, is that you are creating a model of knowledge that is aligned with the lust. So the dominant function is aligned with the child function, but it's trying to create a bigger picture. So the scope of the dominant function is broader than the lust itself, and that's what it means to be drawn away by the lust, is that you're creating a picture, a world view that is consistent with the lust, but the world view is also greater than the lust, or it's broader than the lust, essentially. And then it says, now you see, when you are creating a broad world view that is aligned with the lust, the problem is that you're going to create complications. And this is the problem with the dominant function, is that the dominant function, you can actually get the lust according to the dominant function. The problem is that you won't be willing to pay the price, because the dominant function, when you're a very young person and your dominant function is still growing, it's exciting because you're learning new things every day. And it's like living in a fairy tale, because there are all these new things which you've never heard before. But once you start realizing that there's nothing new under the sun, that you've kind of run out of the unsustainable resource of essentially the novel, then you realize that over that hill is just more of the same type of terrain that I've already mapped out in my worldview. Which means that you can get anything that you want to get. You just have to farm for it. You have to plant the seed. You have to actually do all the work. So there's no free lunch, essentially. And that's the problem, is that if you perfect the dominant function, you actually work out that you can get the lust. You can. But if you really understand the world properly, you'll realize that it won't be pleasant anymore. The lust will actually run... The lust will run you aground, because it won't be enticing anymore. And so you have to be enticed after you develop the dominant function enough. After you develop the dominant function enough, the lust is no longer enough. You have to spice it up even. So you have to be enticed further back to the lust. So you have to be enticed. So this is what I think the parent function is. The parent function is trying to create a way in which you can recapture the luster of the lust. Is trying to sort of promote the cause of the lust, that no, there's still a hidden box of treasure under the terrain. You just have to go looking for it. You have to believe, you have to dream that it's still going to be worth it. That, and this is, I think, the story of Cain and Abel, is that Cain was a farmer, and he knew exactly what he was likely to yield. He knew that if I put in this effort and I don't get wiped out because I understand the weather well enough and I can read the seasons, I know what I'm going to get from the work that I put into the land. He knows. Abel gets to live a much more blessed life, because in some sense he doesn't even farm his animals. His animals are just doing what they naturally do, and he is just helping them by essentially displacing, what a shepherd is doing in terms of shepherding, herds of livestock, is that you are being the pseudo predator. Instead of you're keeping the flock safe from carnivores so that you can be the carnivore. But you're going to do it in such a way that you can maximize things. You're not going to kill the fertile females in your flock, because they actually produce more livestock. if you're going to sacrifice anything, you're going to sacrifice the bulls, because one bull is enough to impregnate all the fertile females, or something like that, or maybe the very young ones that if you're going to kill anything, maybe you'll kill the old ones or something like that are on the way out. Those are the ones worth eating. So before they diminish in size, that's the ones that you choose to eat. So you're a much more sort of intelligent, maximizing predator, or something like that. So I'm putting a different spin on the Cain and Abel story. I'm sympathizing with Cain slightly, and I do actually think that there is something special about the dominant function that is. This is hidden. It's not exactly hidden in the scriptures, but it's slightly hidden in the scriptures. But God promises Cain that he will be protected. That the mark of Cain, people will know that what you do to Cain sevenfold will be visited against them. And then what he also says is that, much further along, I think it was Solomon or David, in one of the Psalms, I think, talked about, if what is done to Cain be revisited, if someone does evil to Cain, that evil be, or that damage be visited onto them sevenfold, or I can't remember if it was six or sevenfold or something like that, but it says whatever be done to Lamech, then 77-fold, I think, be done to them. And Lamech, I think, is basically essentially a spiritual descendant of Cain, and I think that the meaning of the word Lamech, I'm somewhat speculating on the spiritual meaning of it, I guess, is that what I think is special about Lamech, although it's not really explicitly written here in the scripture, is that Lamech, I think, perfected the dominant function, perfected the vanity. He perfected how to be drawn away by the lust in such a way that his vanity, or his dominant function, was actually capable of committing suicide. And I think that this is there's a technology to do with the dominant function, that if a dominant function is actually capable of saying, for efficiency's sake, there will come a time where it's actually worth it for the dominant function to give itself up. Anyway, so this is this is a rabbit hole, which is not really that useful, but anyway, let me talk more about this. Okay, so I think the parent function is being enticed back to the child function, to the lust. Okay, it says, when the lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin. Okay, so it doesn't talk about the trial explicitly, but when it talks about the lust hath conceived, and I think that is what it means to be under trial. So the lust is being conceived. What that means is, conceived means, in this sense, thought about. Like, conceived is past participle, conceived. So it's like when you actually have a full conception of it, when the conception is crystallized into a full, it's fully conceived. You know what it means. What does the lust mean in this state of play after you have been enticed to the lust? So in some sense, I think when the lust hath conceived, this is denoting the aftermath of being enticed towards the lust. So if you are enticed towards the lust, I should have also elaborated that rather than going down that rabbit hole, but essentially a good way of describing this is let's say you don't like your life because it's a drudge, it's a drudgery, and you don't like it, but how you kind of cope with it is that you have a dream, you have a hope for something, and in some sense you have to hope for something. But in this, and I think that that's a generally, we all need to have goals and objectives or whatever. I'm not trying to say that that's a bad thing, But in the context of this false ego complex structure, how I see that playing out is that existentially, you know that to actually get what you want, you can get it, but you don't want to pay the price. You don't want to pay the cost, because you know that essentially it's hollow at the end of the day. So you try to create a recipe in the recipe book of your knowledge of life, of your worldview. You try to create a recipe that breaks the cost formula. And so you're trying to basically say to yourself, there is something that I could do in my life that would be greater than the sum of its parts. You know, so you say that, like, you know, according to the lust, I want a free lunch, but it's impossible to get a free lunch. But maybe if I win the lottery and I go to a penthouse hotel room suite and I buy all the drugs that I want and I'm watching the sunset, that all the ingredients of this somehow together make something that's greater than the sum of its parts. So the enticement, I think, is usually that kind of, you try to create a shortcut. And in some sense, the only way that you can do this is actually by obscuring the dominant function. The parent function has to subvert the dominant function to some degree. But it also tries to not subvert it does and it doesn't. It does by essentially, I think what the parent function is actually doing is it's creating a new lust. It's creating a revised lust, where essentially it's saying, I'm creating a new goal, a new dream that has the same value to the dominant function as the lust has. So that you can try to do both simultaneously through the dominant function. So the dominant function doesn't want to actually do the lust because there's no free lunch in it. So the parent function is trying to create an alternative substitute for the lust, which has the same energy as the lust, but post the cynicism that is naturally born within the dominant function. So archetypally the same cynicism that Cain has against Abel. So, you know, sort of this is Cain, the dominant function is like Cain looking at the parent function and seeing iniquity. Because Abel one-upped his older brother. Cain was the firstborn. Abel, the younger brother, says, oh, I'm going to do what Cain does, but I don't have to learn about when to plant crops. I just have to, I'll be a farmer, but I won't be a farmer of the soil and until the earth. I'll just, you know, the animals will look after themselves. I'll just keep them safe. You know, like I'll just watch what they do and help them do what they do better. You know, like I'll just maximize them. I don't have to know what I'm doing. I just have to kind of follow the formula that Cain has shown me. But I found a way to kind of exacerbate or to optimize it or something like that. So, you know, Abel is portraying himself as a better Cain, but he's kind of sort of, anyway, it's not such an important thing. It's just a way to illustrate it. Anyway, so then what I'm saying is that when the lust hath conceived, so at some point this lust confusion or substitution has to be reconciled as a single conception, as a single actual you have to work out where you actually, how you're operating in relation to it. And because this is a higher dimension, you know, all of these going to the right are higher dimensions than the ones preceding them. The inferior function to conglomerate that this confusion about the lust, or this ambiguity about the lust, to conceive it into a solitary kind of view, at the same time is going to look through the lust. You can only judge the lust and conceive of it clearly in the same vogue, in the same frame as that you are superior to the lust. So the inferior function naturally has a perspective which supersedes the lust to begin with, because that's the only way to conceive of it clearly. So when this has been fully conceived, then this thing will have been accomplished. The next dimension of psychological reality will actually register that you have done something in its ambit. So when you know that you've done this has been conceived. The inferior function has conceived of the lust completely, and that's a judgment. So the inferior function is the trial, is the judgment of the lust. Until it conceives the lust completely, at which point you've already done something on the next dimension. You have performed an action, as you know, in some, you know, there's a lot of theological layers that is built into the British common law and the English legal system, because they kind of were grappling with some of these things. But essentially, you know, they call it a sentence when you are judged. You're given a sentencing, because the action has sort of been fully rendered in the judgment of the court. Sorry, I'm somewhat butchering this, but also the whole point about how also thematically the theme of sin and law fits into it is that the definition of sin, another way of defining sin, is that your will has not been executed. So the will symbolized by the lust never gets done, as it were. It never gets executed. So this thing is displaced by this thing. So this is what you wanted, and this is what you got. So you wanted the lust, but instead you got the sin. You got the non-execution of the lust. Because in some sense, you still did the lust, maybe in some along the way, you still did it. But you didn't execute it. You didn't actually exhaust the motivation, as it were. You didn't finish it, you know. So, and, you know, so it's still, you never completed a cycle of action, to put it in some Scientology language. It's still in this kind of limbo, trapped over here in some sense. There's a kind of limbo here. And so anyway, naturally the parent function doesn't like the inferior function. Therefore, naturally the parent function wants to ignore the inferior function, and it wants to actually create a kind of a membrane here where it actually wants to forget that anything else exists after it. So it'll be like, you know, you deal with your problem, I'll deal with my problem. And so the non-integration between these two things. So when I talk about perfecting the vanity, incorporating the local inferior function into the local dominant function is in some sense to crucify the lust to some degree. You're going to do that, but you're also going to get this into a more natural state, or into a more healthy, balanced state, as it were, so that when it communicates to other things, it can kind of stabilize. I guess this is a bad example with the unconscious, because the reason why this is a bad example is because, you know, the unconscious parent function just leads itself back to the superego's parent function, which is still important. It's still probably a linchpin in something, but more proximately, you want the subconscious and the ego to grow up and be at least a kind of, you know, you can be on the right spiritual journey with these things, even, you know, it might still take a long time, but, you know, if you don't have this right, you kind of, you know, so you might, this is, the long road is the unconscious and the superego, but before you walk that road, you have to kind of have the right head on your shoulders, as it were. You have to sort of be in the right condition, so it's not just sort of, otherwise you'll wander off the road, even if you found the right road to walk, because you just don't have the kind of the resources, the internal capacity to stick onto it. So anyway, and yeah, I mean, I know that I've got these words which are almost slightly sacrilegious here, because in some sense this is meant to be a bit of a mockery on some level, these words, but they're meant to evoke essentially how people internally relate to them to some degree. That how the parent function relates to its own foundation, in how the parent function in the unconscious relates to its own foundation, is that it's trying to sort of influence it through prayer, and how the parent function of the superego is kind of, I'm just trying to think of the word that I used in my earlier recordings from a long time ago when I was describing this stuff. Primes, it sort of primes this inferior function in the subconscious. And in some sense, you can always see also that, I mean, I don't exactly, this is something that I empirically kind of intuited. So I don't have evidence that this is actually the thing that is connected here. Because what I'm about to say is certainly not a reason that leads me towards that, but you can almost understand why this parent function, why the local parent function would prefer that the inferior function be managed by an external entity, so that it can kind of, and in some sense I think that these connections as well are kind of learned, that these are perhaps not even necessarily how it works. This is just kind of how it naturally, in some sense I think that these are caused by a kind of numerology of just in terms of, well, if this is going to be the prime false prophet, and this is going to be the dominant function, the thing that is before the false prophet, and this is going to be the child function of the dominant function that is before the false prophet, and this is what you kind of start off with, in maybe from a chromosome, or maybe from the beginning of the development of one's internal. I mean, I think probably animals have a superego, like they just essentially can't ever anchor their ego, because they don't have a subconscious that is capable of imprinting on these models of the unconscious and the ego, and organizing this into an understanding, that human beings have understanding, that's or at least we have the capacity for understanding. So I do think that sort of what makes us human is essentially qualities of the subconscious, which can also sort of be dulled and can also be educated to some degree, or pedagogically kind of developed, or anyway. But what I just mean in terms of numerology is that once a kind of pattern starts going in a kind of cascade, in a kind of domino effect, it just so happens that, like, once you have some starting parent functions and dominant functions, that sort of the natural next step is that these things, these powerhouses, these independent powerhouses, come in and fill in the gap of the kind of no man's land of intersection between two sides of the mind that overlap each other. And there's a natural disjuncture between the parent function and the inferior function in a local side of the mind. So something comes in and fills the void, because sort of inferior functions need insight or something like that to conceive of the lust. And so there's a natural proclivity perhaps for them to outsource their insight. That essentially, if you are looking at a dimension that precedes the foundation of so for example, if this inferior function is being primed by this parent function in the superego, it makes sense that the inferior function, to judge what's going on here, needs to be informed by the thing that is immediately prior to the foundation. It exists underneath the foundation. It's interesting as well, there are also scriptures that talk about descending, that it talks about the ascended man, in which it means the man who understands God, the man who perhaps a good description of Christ consciousness, but it says essentially that you have to descend below the earth and and even deal with the beast essentially. And anyway, but maybe that's a bad parallel to draw here, and I'm not even quoting the scripture fully, and but that anyway, to me it makes sense that this would link up with this, so that and also essentially with this powerhouse over here, so that it could properly contextualize and conceive of the lust going on. And then you can also understand why there's a basic enmity between the parent function and this inferior function, because this is going to be very uncomfortable, because this is kind of going to have very uncomfortable truths that are very incongruent with the parent, with at least the dominant function in the local side of the mind. But yeah, I mean, if you can kind of weather the inferior function into this, then you can actually have a kind of model of the primary counteroffer inside the subconscious. And if you can do that, then you're going to have a subconscious that already has a backdoor key to the superego, which means that it can pass it on to the ego, which can pass it on to the ego's inferior function, which I think is the most independent structure in the false ego complex, is the ego's inferior function. But sadly it has very little to do because it's not connected to anything. So the only way that it can actually do something is if it sort of reaches out its hand and does this all by itself and integrates with the superego's dominant function, sort of reincarnates within, or is reborn and creates a new pseudo child function in the combination of this inferior function. But you want this inferior function to inherit all the, you want it to inherit yourself. You don't, you want eternal life, like this is, I think, how eternal life has happened, is that these things, when they are properly integrated, they can come into the ego's inferior function, which then can essentially be the anyway, I've described that in an earlier recording, that this is the kind of, to describe sort of the resurrection here, or the crucifixion, excuse me. And I think in Revelations, when it's talking about the first death and the second death, and essentially those who kind of get an early ticket into being informed in this are the more important pivotal, like it says that, those are the priests and the rulers, I think, of the temple of the Lord, in the New Jerusalem, essentially, that they are the pillars of the temple. And anyway, so and so essentially after you develop a new personality, the thing that went into informing the new personality to begin with, because other things can be added to it afterwards, but the things that survived the first death, or that got translated here in the first place, are the parts of yourself that you know, sort of were the things that were specifically elected, called and chosen by God, essentially. You know, is the way to frame it in a purely theological sense. But anyway, okay, so that basically what I'm saying is there's a bootstrapped version of necessary things that essentially are woven into an emergent responsibility within the ego that is in some sense capable of forming what I would even maybe describe as like a secret devotion that is cleansed, that is redeemed, that whatever secret devotion had begun when the ego developed in the first place, you know, and people developed into the fall of their fallen psyche in terms of their false consciousness and their false ego, that this was somewhat complicit. And then it kind of even continues to play the game where, you know, sort of the question is keeping it within this kind of secret devotion, which, you know, it's, in some sense, you can almost, you know, once you start to understand the truth of these structures a bit more, you can almost say, I always knew this, you know, like I did not know it in some sense. It's just that, you know, sort of it was mesmerizing, it was confusing, I was, you know, very self-deluded or something like that. And in some sense, the question, I think, to a large extent, is the disguise of that self-delusion. But it's also a necessary, you know, it's interesting that in Revelations, John, who is having the dream, who is being led and shown all these things and having these things explained to him, when he's looking at the whore of Babylon, or he's looking at the woman on the back of the dragon, of the scarlet dragon, and he says that I admired her, or no, I can't remember the exact word, but essentially he was astonished by her, and then the person who he was with said, that woman who you were admiring, I'll explain the secret around her. And essentially, I think this is somewhat the question, is that when you don't understand, you have to admire it, because in some sense it contains all mystery, you know, which is one of the names on the forehead of the whore of Babylon, is mystery. And, you know, this is, you know, the role of mystery is you know, is a huge theme within the Christian doctrine. And people really, you know, in Psalms it says things like the mystery of God will never end, it will go on forever and ever, it's always sort of deep or whatever. And they fail to overlook essentially how mystery is involved within, you know, essentially one of the avatars of the fall, you know, the whore of Babylon, essentially. And, you know, one of her names is essentially mystery. But also that in Revelations it says explicitly, "In the mystery of God shall be finished." So, you know, at some point you kind of have to stop trying. In some sense, I think that the mystery is really related to the unconscious, um, and in some sense, you can see that, because how can we serve God if we don't know the will of God? You know, like it's sort of, you know, how do you know what is the will of God? You have to understand it at some point. If you don't understand it, sort of, and I mean, it's very interesting in Revelations how these things are, I would say, how they are illustrated and described, where it says, and you will receive a white stone, and only you can read the name on that white stone, and it's your name essentially, and in some sense that's the kind of, the law that is written on your heart, I guess, is somewhat, has a bit of a parallel to that. But only you know the name, and just the word name is a very interesting word. What does name mean? Words are almost always name. All words are names. The name of something is how you know something. So the definition of any word is how you know it. So names is almost the same thing as definition. It's the same thing as perspectival belief. The problem is that perspectives can't ground themselves. You can't have a perspective grounding a perspective. You have to have a perspective within the context of a propositional kind of impetus, or a kind of, the compass direction is relevant if you have no capacity to sort of to traverse ground. If you have no propulsion, what's the point of, like a heading? A compass is used so that you can head in a certain direction. If you have no so even the word heading presupposes that there is a change or a movement or a flow of something, and so it's like meaning really comes in style. It comes in, I mean, even I think in Revelations, when it's talking about, is your name written in the book of life, this is a very kind of profound way of describing that it's not your works that make you saved or unsaved. It's your workings. It's the themes in your life. It's not the effects. It's the themes, as it were. And this is, like you kind of have to get very metaphorical within the fruitfulness kind of thing. Judge someone by their fruits. But like, what is the fruit of the Spirit? And it's sort of not exactly. I don't think it's that easy to kind of diagnose from necessarily sort of conventional external markings, as it were. But and especially, I mean, as things get more complicated in the world, as it were, it's very easy to kind of lose the concept of fruitfulness in a deluge of some utilitarian reduction. And essentially, because it's also very easy for people to aggregate nice things or convenience, you can kind of be spiritually swamped in counterfeit fruitfulness, I would say. So it's interesting that perhaps in simpler times it would have been easier to see, oh, well, someone's got a sustainable form of living that's, let's say, karmically sustainable or emotionally sustainable or sort of emotionally transcendent. Whereas, like, I don't think it's necessarily visible, or in some sense it's always been argued that this has been invisible to the world, because in some sense the fruitfulness really has to do with the internal quality of the style of the decision making. That in some sense it's not about some kind of utilitarian efficaciousness, it's about a kind of qualitative potency within the workings, not in terms of the work that has been rendered in some worldly objective or absolute sense. So, you know, and this is really, at some point you have to ground, what is it that you do? What are you going to ground that in? Is that going to be grounded in an external locus of control, in an external narrative, or in an internal locus of control and understanding that is self-consistent and coherent, and that professes to have a justified understanding? And that sounds like a tall order, and it is. It's what that is the work of salvation, I would say. But anyway, sorry, I'm pontificating a bit all over the place. Okay, so I don't know if I should talk about this. Should probably be talking about the field circuits more. I guess I'll make that a new recording.